Welcome. I am Carol Summerfield. I am the Executive Director here at the History Center, and I wanted to welcome you to this event. This is a Preservation Society event, but one of the reasons that we're doing this is because as we extend that partnership and working together, it's really important that we find ways to create symbiotic opportunities for us to talk about why we both exist as organizations. So we are here for the sociology of history. We talk about why community history matters and what we can do to create a stronger sense of community, and working in partnership with the Preservation Society that is dedicated to the stewardship and the preservation of this community is really critical on both sides. So with that, I welcome you. I hope you enjoy your time here. If you have a chance afterwards, please go see the exhibit that we literally just put up yesterday that was curated by students from Lake Forest College. We're really proud of it. It's the beginning of our 50th anniversary, and we've got a lot coming. So, Susie, thank you again.
Wow. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming today to this very special program. I am Susan Athenson, president of the Lake Forest Foundation, or Lake Forest Preservation Foundation. We call it the foundation for short. Today, the Lake Forest Preservation Foundation and the Lake Forest Lake Bluff History Center are proud to sponsor Lake Forest Forward, a sensible and sensitive approach to development in our historic center, a conversation about the future of preservation, planning, and development in our community's historic uptown. So before we begin, I would like to thank all the people behind the scenes that helped create this program today. First, thank you to the Lake Forest Preservation Foundation Committee that worked for months putting this program together. Our Executive Director, Marcy Kerr, Perry Georgopoulos, Patty Poth, Courtney Trombley, Trey Gonzalez, Laura Terosian, Art Miller, and especially Tom Rajkovich. Thank you also to the Lake Forest Lake Bluff History Center, their Executive Director, Carol Summerfield, and their staff for hosting us today in this beautiful space. This building is one of our recent Historic Preservation Award winners for adaptive reuse, and we are so thankful for them for hosting and sponsoring the program with us. So today we are so honored to have with us two nationally recognized experts in classical architecture and urban planning. Thomas Rajkovich is a practicing architect, urban designer, preservationist, and educator, named as one of the top 40 architects of his generation in the United States by the Architecture League of New York. He graduated with high honors from the University of Notre Dame and is an affiliated fellow of the American Academy in Rome. Tom has led his award-winning Evanston-based practice of architecture for more than 30 years, designing projects ranging from the restoration and enlargement of historically significant structures to new classical residential and institutional buildings in sensitive historic settings to traditional campus master plans. The office is currently designing projects in Illinois, Northern Michigan, and Rhode Island. He has also taught as a visiting professor or served as a guest critic at several universities, including Yale and Notre Dame, where he will be teaching a graduate design studio this fall. Tom has been a regular speaker with the Preservation Foundation. His first lecture to our group was Harry T. Lindbergh and the Scholarly Tradition, which took place 23 years ago this summer. Stefanos Polyzoides, the Francis and Kathleen Rooney Dean of the School of Architecture, joined the University of Notre Dame School of Architecture in 2020. His career has engaged a broad span of architecture and urbanism, its history, theory, design, and education. He is one of 6 co-founders of the Congress for the New Urbanism, and with his wife, Elizabeth Moule, a partner in Moule and Polyzoides, a Pasadena, California practice since 1990. His professional expertise includes the design of educational, institutional, commercial, and civic buildings, historic rehabilitation, housing, and the urban design of university campuses, neighborhoods, and district. Mr. Polyzoides has led such projects throughout the United States and around the world. He is a co-author of many books and has also helped organize 4 distinguished exhibitions and exhibition catalogs on the architectural and urban history of Southern California. Born in Athens, Greece, Mr. Polyzoides earned his bachelor's and master's degrees in architecture and urban planning from Princeton University and has lived in Southern California since 1973. He was a faculty member at the University of Southern California School of Architecture from 1973 to 1996 and is a registered architect. Please welcome Tom Rajkovich and Stefanos Polyzoides.
So the Preservation Foundation engaged me in a conversation some time ago about a series of situations, circumstances that were taking place in Lake Forest that led them to believe that we needed to enlarge the discussion, the preservation discussion, beyond simply celebrating the heritage that already existed in the community. So I'm going to just say a few words briefly to give context, and then we're going to hear from my friend and my boss, Dean Polyzoides, who will enlarge that, and then we're going to do a question and answer, which we're going to engage you in at the end of. So as many of you probably know, but if you don't, you should, the preservation movement as a grassroots thing really was given birth with the tragic demolition in 1963 in New York City of Penn Station. The loss of McKim, Mead & White's building, magnificent building, created this kind of grassroots movement, like how could this be happening? And the New York Times architectural critic Ada Louise Huxtable noted that we'd given up on taking care of the things that mattered the most to us. And so the preservation movement was born, and what it started to celebrate in its early years, so in the 1960s and even into the 1970s, were those singular sort of telltale great buildings. And a piece of that emerged from the legacy of modernism in modern education. In other words, we celebrate the architect as a genius. So we see Thomas Jefferson's Monticello. So buildings started being saved sort of singularly. It was important as an individual building. But if you look at the lettering above the top, you'll see that preservation only is held in foundation by one piece of that. So what the image gets continued as preservation continues to evolve, and preservation begins to recognize that it's not purely about individual buildings, but instead of places. Place making is what preservation really needs to be about, because great buildings need to be understood within great contexts, that buildings act together as ensembles, not as isolated incidents or objects. And so preservation sort of comes into a fullness in the 70s when it recognizes that districts should be preserved, towns should be preserved. And so it brings to mind as well that preservation for a long time looked back and said these old things are good. And this is a depiction of a 19th century sculpture of the Roman god Janus, who gives us the name of the month of January and represents the idea of transitions from new beginnings. So Janus looks old on the one side, he has a beard, and then this youthful face on the other side. And preservation began to recognize that it wasn't purely about looking backward, but in fact the reason why we do preservation, why this organization and others do preservation, is because we're aiming toward a better future. So we look vibrantly and sort of optimistically toward the future. The youth inherit the world that our elders have given us, and preservation therefore has to think in both of those ways, which is what gave rise to today's event. So what is it about places that make them worth preserving, and why would an organization like the Preservation Foundation, or better yet, the City of Lake Forest, why should they care about preserving, and what does preservation in that context mean? So we care about places of distinct and harmonious character, and we will hear during the course of the afternoon what constitutes distinct but also harmonious character. We think about places of beauty, and we can come to sort of common consensus about what constitutes a beautiful place. It's a place where people can live lives that are both meaningful and joyful. We think about places that ennoble. In other words, when you walk out the door, the place you live or the place you visit ought to be something that elevates who you are. It elevates the dignity of your behavior. It elevates how you view the world. It lets you grab your child by the hand and move joyfully through that place. And so places that are consequently a proper setting for our aspirations and standards. So that's a kind of a lofty thing, but that's exactly what an organization like the Preservation Foundation ought to be about. The loftiness of understanding what an aspiration might be, rather than simply the practical realities of where we're living. And so here are a series of examples of places that have that sort of distinct beauty and character. You're probably familiar with at least some of them. The top left is Oxford. The top right is Siena, Italy. The bottom left is Bruges, Belgium, and the bottom right is Georgetown in Washington, D.C. And what I would note is that each one of those have very distinct and unified architectural character. So if you think about those phrases on the first slide, they are places that would ennoble by your ability to walk the streets. They are places of beauty. They are places which are harmonious. And it's clear which of the buildings in these places are shared civic buildings, public buildings, institutional buildings, and which of them are the places where we all sort of retreat to at the end of the day to live our lives. The reason why preservation needs to exist in that Janus-like form, though, is because we're at this sort of juncture moment where architecture, sadly, and urban design are producing places which aren't so wonderful. And so hence today's meeting is trying to endeavor to make sure that we don't suffer those outcomes. So architecture has now become more about any place, meaning that any place looks like any place else. The sort of sameness, the homogeneity, the ubiquitousness, and the ugliness have effectively meant that anywhere you go, you're actually no place. Because I can go to, and I won't name towns because this is on video, I can go to places not far from here and pull into the center of a town and go 3 towns over and see exactly the same buildings, more or less, exactly the same retail outlets, more or less, and a kind of a homogenized architecture. The biggest problem is that we've homogenized and rendered ubiquitous the idea of things that are ugly. And so this is from a recent article that is available online on Bloomberg, which depicts housing in, these are 4 different cities. I'll let you guess which state they're in. It's 4 different states. And so obviously you can tell which one's from Colorado because it looks like Colorado. I'll let you guess which one is from Massachusetts because it has the sense that it belongs near Boston. And part of the point is that there's been an industrialization in the way that we build residential buildings in particular, but also architecture as well. And so that homogeneity goes hand in hand with ugliness, because now all it's about is creating certain sort of decorations. I won't be any more overt than that, but to say that Lake Forest really doesn't need a building that makes it look like Boston and Colorado and New Jersey and Southern California. So whether it gets a little more dolled up, and this is an example very near to a place that I'm sometimes spend weekdays out in South Bend, or a place, this is actually Colorado, and you can tell it's Colorado because it has that kind of mining town timber work up near the eaves. Or places that recognize that they have this distinct sort of Georgian architectural heritage, and so as long as you have some gables, it's always best if they're sort of coupled together. White timber work and red brick. You've effectively achieved a kind of a contextual design. The point of what our conversation today should be about is that recognizing the unique character of place means that this kind of architecture can't happen, and you certainly can't have libraries that end up looking like this, nor like that. Which brings us to this place, and the fact that even though there's an enormous amount of diversity in the town that all of you are fortunate to call home, I live a little further down the shore but not far away, has a very distinct architectural character. And while there are moments that are less sort of benevolent in terms of their aesthetics than others, between Howard Van Doren Shaw and a number of other architects, you've been able to build a larger community that has that harmoniousness, that has that architectural consistency, that has that sense of beauty that should be continued. So we have to be like Janus and think about these things going forward. And our predecessors gave us all the information we could ever possibly need in terms of understanding from what was done nearly 100 years ago to what was done not so terribly long ago, that you can actually make a unified environment that has plenty of diversity. No one's going to confuse the Deer Path Inn with the new bank building and that new ensemble at the north end of the Market Square. No one's going to confuse the magnificent Northern Trust Bank by Stanley Anderson, which is literally one of my favorite buildings ever, or the City Hall. So in other words, there is diversity and there is variety here, but the piece that's absent in this assemblage is what happens on all those missing blocks and what comes next. And so today's event, and Stefanos is going to articulate this in all of his remarks, is how we best act in that setting as responsible people.
I promised Tom I was not going to give a lecture. So I'm not going to give a lecture, but I do have 6 slides to show you because I want to say a few words that might set up some further context above and beyond what Tom provided. The first image is an image of one of the great monuments of our country, which is the Plan for Savannah, Georgia by James Oglethorpe, 1733. I present it to you in order to begin this discussion by claiming that architecture is not an aesthetic matter alone, but it's also a social one, an economic one, and a political one. And in those 3 ways, it speaks to our ability and interest as a society to see to it that whatever we build has a depth of mining community out of us in a way that allows us to move over time in a way that everyone and everything we do prospers. This is a reminder in the same spirit that while the act of building is a singular act, somebody designs, somebody builds, somebody comes and finishes these objects, the act of city making and the act of engaging nature is one that is collective, and one that guarantees that what we eat, what we drink, what we breathe, how we relate to each other, how to define ourselves through our institutions is actually part and parcel of the act of being an architect and the acts of generating the built world around us. It's a very profound issue because we're all pretending somehow that the environmental crisis in which we're enveloped at this particular moment somehow descended upon us. But the fact is that the environmental crisis is an urban crisis. We've been building and living and taking care of this world very sloppily, and it is our errors and our trespasses are piling up and are generating challenges that it is going to be very, very difficult to overcome in the future. Luckily, we live in a blessed country from many points of view, but there's no blessing more important than knowing what your rights as an individual are, which are built into property rights, among other things, as they're shown in a map of the kind that we saw before, and also in community responsibilities and covenants that have to do with the way we act together, despite the way our country has been marching recently. So I tried. This is my 5th hour in this magnificent city. I brought you the sunshine, but I found a depth of architecture that I did not expect, both in quality or in volume. I'm completely astonished by what a magnificent city this is. And so the points that you made, Tom, and the points we're going to discuss are going to be, I think, even deeper in their importance of this place than I had imagined through Zoom and telephone discussions. So I wanted to give you a 5-slide summary of where we are in the world. I know it's a bit risky, but we have a tremendous number of places made for us by our ancestors that speak to the nature of our culture. And I could have chosen any examples, but I'm going to choose only the ones that I visited, a small town in Indiana, Goshen, near South Bend, that I visited last weekend. And I want to show you that in our understanding of what a city is, built into it clearly and centrally is the idea of a home. Doesn't have to be necessarily a single family house such as this, but the home which this image represents is not only a matter of the social structure that we have set up for ourselves, but it's actually an architectural act of great prominence and great value, of great boldness, and most importantly, it is different in every part of the country. New Mexican houses don't look like this. Houses in Maine don't look like this. Houses in New Orleans don't look like this. And then in these same towns, Goshen again, there are intact and magnificent downtowns of a different kind of architecture, which is commercial, and speaks to the need to interact with each other in various ways, including civically. And the civic markers in this milieu are overwhelming and extraordinarily important. They speak to the democratic core of this country, and they were the buildings that were first built in most of the cities. So this central square of Goshen is like every other central square in every other of the counties of Indiana. But this very simple construct of public space, civic monuments representing togetherness and democratic governance, buildings that give us community, buildings that give us the possibility to exchange services and objects that we're giving to each other or selling to each other, and homes. That simple balance that you find in almost every city, including this one, is being threatened by two very fundamental forces at this point. I'm sorry, there was one more point about how close these are, how knit those things are, and they are extraordinarily well knit. The first one is incompetence. This is a project in Goshen for a new courthouse. The two courthouses in Elkhart and Goshen are being emptied, including the one I just showed you, because we need $2 million to fix them. So the county is spending $100 million to buy this piece of land nowhere and to build a building surrounded by cars. This is happening in a red state that is considered to be significantly politically to the right, being conservative and therefore careful about the way money is being spent. And this is a building that I don't think will be there in 50 years. So incompetence and maybe apathy on the part of the public as well, allowing decisions to be taken in the public realm without serious discussion, serious enumeration of alternatives, serious addressing of the responsibilities and the consequences of the actions that are brought from a responsible perspective. The second one is, let's say, the commercializing of a culture and the building of interests in lack of balance between private prerogatives and corporate ones. Yes, there is too much money in the hands of too few people in this country, but this has existed since the beginning of time here. The problem is that there are interests that do not see as their civic responsibility to build in a way that is responsible to the rest of their citizens and to the shape and performance and nature of their town. And that is a significant problem. This is my hometown, Pasadena, after an invasion from Mars. And it turns out that the people that invaded were probably our neighbors, and we didn't know it. And so I will finish by saying that we have a practice in California and now in Indiana that is actually dealing with questions like the ones that you may be facing in the city about how to maintain the future of a city like this in a prosperous frame while keeping its physical environment familiar and enabling. And this is becoming a national problem, a national challenge, and a national priority. The other thing, though, that is emerging, and I'm now speaking as an educator for a second, is that we are also beginning to see a shift in the way in which architecture is being both understood, practiced, and more importantly, taught. And that is that architecture is not about the making of single buildings, but it's about making places. It is about addressing at the same time objects, the space between them, their uses and their economic performance, nature in all of its forms, whether it's infrastructural improvements that one needs, or access to gardens, or access to agriculture, and certainly the whole environmental question, particularly around maintaining clean water, clean air, and minimum commuting as an objective. So, however complex and difficult this sounds, you cannot solve problems of single buildings without understanding this enormous complexity. So I hope the discussion today is about how to make the extremely complex better comprehended and how to begin to make decisions that allow you to to move forward together as a community, because that's the important thing. No one can stop or should stop anyone else in a situation like this, the one you're living in a relatively small city. Whatever you do has to be done from perspective of consensus. So how do you get there is the challenge and the subject of discussion this afternoon. Thank you.
As you heard from Stefanos, part of the consideration when you're doing work in a community like Lake Forest is establishing what is the mechanism, what is the methodology for assuring that new development, which, and think about our friend Janice up there looking toward the future, what is the mechanism that assures that the next set of constructions that happen here, the things that it will inevitably happen here and you want to have happen here because you want economic prosperity in this community, you don't want it to become static and set in amber. You want it to be a living, breathing place that young people want to live and bring their families to continue to sort of regenerate itself. What are the mechanisms that we need? What are the mechanisms, Stefanos, that Lake Forest should be looking toward that help to assure a kind of a fundamental sense that the character of place that you witnessed today when we walked around, that the character of place can be maintained and amplified, the distinctions between character as we see it here and style?
Well, can we leave the second question for one point later?
Yeah.
I would say that there are two parts to the first question. On the Mission Impossible side, one would have to say that as citizens of the state and of this country, you would have to support every effort to make more lake forests. Because what you're witnessing, for instance, in the increase of your rents everywhere and the astronomical increase in the price of your houses, is that the market is being driven by the scarcity of greatness in the environmental front and in the urban front. And so every place in the country that's any good is going to be bid out into the stratosphere in the next 50 years. That's what we're witnessing. So at the first level, I'll say, do your very best to stop sprawl and start building towns around you of a kind that people might want to live in and bid up and leave you alone to some extent. The second one is that in order to establish a balance in the development of any place, you need a strong community organization, a strong community input, and you need a lively civic realm, a civic discussion. And the civic discussion is not only a matter of leadership on the part of elected people and mayors and administration and staff and so on, it's also a question of what instruments are in place in order to control the growth of a place like this. And I would say that most zoning codes are antiquated nationwide, even form-based codes, which is the latest way of trying to shape buildings according to preordained conditions, are effective, but not as effective as having a good architect and a conscious and collaborative community in which things can be talked back and forth to best result. I would say, last point is that even if the zoning codes are not up to snuff, it seems to me that generally zoning has so poorly stated as an instrument for making a built environment that cities should be looking at the existing zoning as the maximum to be built in any place and not the minimum. In other words, for somebody, either you have to revisit your codes and give developers 30% more, or you should be adhering to your standards and treating those standards as religion. Because the best way to undo your town is to be treating every project as an exception. So it seems to me that holding the line about what zoning is an important issue that needs to be discussed, and particularly because the way architects and developers treat zoning is they think of you've seen the buildings you don't like, they're all boxes. And the reason they're boxes is because they're geometric diagrams of entitlement. If somebody says you can have 40,000 square feet, instead of people trying to organize a building from the building to this footage, they start from the footage to the building. Therefore, they constantly and always end up with boxes, which means that it is probably very questionable whether you could build a building that's acceptable by sticking to the zoning numbers. Every one of the buildings that you have that you love and admire are probably 5 or 10% less than the zoning envelope. And how do you satisfy the individual rights of the developers? Maybe by making some height exceptions or this exception or the other exception without destroying a project. But by and large, I think, by forming projects within serious guidelines and serious standards of a kind that are respected by all and understood by all.
What do you think are the mechanisms that would induce a sense of civic responsibility when new projects are undertaken in a place like Lake Forest? What can the community, either through the aldermen and the city council and the mayor's office, the community development office, and the Lake Forest Preservation Foundation, other groups, what can they do to help basically engage developers so that work going forward, because we believe that to keep a healthy community here, you need new buildings, and there are places where the streets are basically interrupted by the lack of buildings, that as those buildings take place, what is it that can induce in a person undertaking that project, whose primary motivation obviously is a financial one, that there's a civic responsibility that has to do with that whole character of place, which is Lake Forest?
I would say education, common experiences, walking around and talking about things and understanding why they're right or wrong, bringing people in to talk in detail about issues, understanding that traffic, parking, open space, landscape, buildings are a singular issue and they have to be discussed that way. Putting goals that buildings have to fulfill in order to get things done. It is a matter, I think, that has to be addressed through building slowly and deliberately in measures that generate comfort and bring beliefs that are clashing into some common arena, that people understand each other's needs and each other's languages. It's a difficult subject because we live in a society which has become utterly exploitative when it comes to transactions. Everything is a monetary exchange, and what gets produced from this monetary exchange is not significant. If you look around you, I walked around your post office today and your city hall. Can you imagine building a building like this in our time? Daring do a thing like this? And yet, that's what the uniqueness and oneness of this country is based on buildings like that, on sharing those buildings as being of a common heritage. Well, how do you do that today? You do it by educating people to see, to understand how these things relate to the economy that is, and to maybe choose architects that know how to deliver these buildings. Much of the problem is that all the magnificent buildings here were built by magnificent architects, and not the buildings that are being now are being built by architects who may not be guilty of any particular crime, but they're working within a language that just does not deliver the same kind of city.
Do you think it's reasonable to describe the aesthetic character of Lake Forest as a whole, the residential districts, but also obviously primarily that shared civic area that we call the Market Square and the areas surrounding the Market Square, which have public architecture? Do you think it's reasonable to describe all of that collectively as effectively reflecting a sort of brand that is Lake Forest? Is that crass to think of Lake Forest as having effectively a brand so that people that own homes here, people who wish to build new buildings here, understand that in some sense they have to live up to the standard of that brand, but that also brings about a sense that the community has value associated with its uniqueness. Not necessarily exceptionalism, because there are other great communities and we recognize that we don't have to compete in that way, but to make beautiful places that are unique, and obviously there's a unique character in place here, is thinking of a community and communicating with developers that this is a brand. Is that a reasonable strategy?
I hate the word brand because it leads directly into the question of a transaction. You know, brand is a matter of fashion. Do you think any of the people, your fathers and mothers, grandparents, any of the architects thought of what they built here as being a brand? They thought of what they did as being a place, and a magnificent place. And so the subject becomes one of values and the one of identity. I mean, I would say I can't really place the city within the top 5, 10, 20, or 100 in the United States, but I would say without doubt is in the problem the top 5% of towns and cities in the US easily. Is that distinguished? Is that distinguished as an entity, right? When I say entity, I mean roads, light posts, parks, buildings, everything together, right? An ensemble, a construct altogether. So when somebody has lived here for 30 years, 60 years, or 90 years, I'm sure many people in the room have lived here all their lives and all their families as well. You are this place. You cannot detach yourselves from the grass out there, from the elm trees, or from the city hall. You are this place. So the reason for not diluting it or destroying it is not because it is a brand or because it's going to cost or this or the other, is because you want to make absolutely sure that you've received it, you've refined it, you have cared for it, and you're handing it on to your children and grandchildren, hoping that this can go on. Because if as a human race, we do not begin to think about our life on this earth being a kind of relay in which we go for 60 or 80 years and we hand the baton to somebody else who goes for another 60 or 80 years and keeps the place up and improves it physically, improves it civically, improves it politically, and in every other way, then we're lost, people. I mean, we're really lost, right? Because for the longest period of time, and under modernism, not as an aesthetic, but as a political and economic system, we're basically depleting the earth. We're eating it up. We're consuming it. We're consuming it and we're spitting away the pits. And when you look at this extraordinary example around you, this is not an example of depletion. It's an example of multiplication of a miraculous kind. The fact is that the buildings that are being built today on strips around you, on all the strips, are built to last 7 years. And I would dare say that the buildings in this town, if you took them in the aggregate, probably at least 80% of them are around 100 years old. And it's not that you're preservationists, that this is the good deed that you've done, and you're enjoying them as objects in some peculiar museum, some kind of Disneyland, on the North Shore. It is really that they are alive. And I think we have to come to the point of understanding that the industrial culture, the industrial complex in which, commercial industrial complex in which we live, does not care about longevity, does not care about durability, and does not care about the values that you in principle care about. And that is what we have to address going forward in everything we do, in everything that we do. 7-year buildings are going to take us down a very deep hole. They're taking us down a deep hole from which we cannot easily recover. And building in a way that lasts 500 years. This town, I dare say, this town is going to be here in 500 years. I will guarantee, I'll be here to check it out. But it will last 500 years. That's the way it's built. Making sure that people don't start, finishing the stone the wrong way.
If I go out in the street anywhere where my office is in Evanston, almost anywhere, South Bend, anywhere, it would be very easy for me to conclude that our culture celebrates two things: consumption and entertainment. How do you achieve sustainable growth in a place where the drivers of that growth related to current interests, current expectations, current ambitions, what is a library today versus what is a library once upon a time? What is residential living today when you live in a multifamily building outside of the city of Chicago? Consumption and entertainment tend to drive a lot of the architectural response to those project solutions. How do we create a sustainable mindset that overcomes those tendencies so that it's authentically durable, not just physically durable, although that would be important too, but also durable in the ways you're describing, where 500 years from now, those buildings are still purposeful and loved?
Consumption, entertainment, and in my case, driving fast. That's 3. So all of those have to do with not seeing. And I think you need to start moving more slowly, all of you, all of us, going through the city, our daily lives, looking around and understanding why we're enjoying being here. We don't enjoy being here because of how prosperous we are, but we're enjoying being here because of the seasons, because of the size of certain rooms we live in, because of the light that we enjoy, or the fact that we can walk to coffee, or know that you can walk to a post office in town and drop a letter. I found out today through our walk that the post office is leaving town. That's a crime. This cannot happen. How can you take the post office away from the center of town? So we need to make sure that our daily lives correspond to the shape, the enclosure that was given to us by 300 years, 200 years of exceedingly deep sacrifice and great insight. One of the most amazing things to think about is that we know just about everything we need to know, and people 100 years before made buildings that are 10 times better than ours. Not only is design, but it's construction. How do people with half of the brains that we have do things that are 10 times better? That's a very difficult question to answer, right? Exceedingly difficult. It's a matter of values. It's a matter of what you do and why you do it. And therefore, I would say, other than settling our lives down and looking around and understanding this framework that was given to us here in this city as being of the essence to our identity and our values, the next thing is, every time you have to do something about it, you have to think about the choice that you have and how to do it. And believe me, I'm not speaking as an anti-modernist or as an anti-progress person. I'm not a Luddite, but I do believe that there needs to be a change of mind about change itself. In other words, change is inevitable. When I look at my pictures of when I was 20, I can barely recognize who I was. And it's not only a matter of face-to-face interaction, it's a way the way is changing. I mean, retail has changed the last 20 years in a way that's completely staggering. And so has the last 25 years of computers, which has touched almost everything that we do. But yet this world, the world that I'm looking at out the window, this world is there still, the same world. And we have to honor it and we have to be able to continue it, but taking into consideration the pace and nature of change. We have to control change in this completely incredibly speedy and irrelevant world and try to contain the culture of short-term profit, which is this constant monetizing of everything.
As you saw the entire retail and commercial and civic district this morning and this afternoon, and you walked around, and we talked about the places where there were gaps and missing buildings and some buildings that were of insubstantial quality compared to the others. As you look at it, is it the sort of place you think should simply be about hanging on to and preserving as much as possible of the good and sort of reconciling ourselves to the idea that stuff happens and that some of the things that might happen next are not compatible with what's there? Or do you look at that in your experience with the work you're doing in your office and say, this is a place where the kind of growth that it almost ought to have to fill itself out and to revitalize the kind of living base of that immediate neighborhood, that it can be done effectively, beautifully, and contribute so that the future sum of the parts is even better than what's there now? Do you have an optimistic view about that? Do you think, or do you have a cautious view about it?
I have a very optimistic view of that because I just walked out of a fifth-year thesis review at Notre Dame, and the work of the students was embarrassing in its riches. I was, for the first time, jealous of them. Their work was completely incredible. You could get kids to finish this holes here, this missing teeth, and they would do the right thing. It's incredible, actually, what's coming. But that's one of 136 schools in the United States. So there are other kinds of problems that we have on that front. I would say that, first of all, we have to tame the car. There's way too many open parking lots in this downtown. There's way too much of that kind of loose space. And the urbanity is the number one characteristic of a great downtown, where you put a wall of buildings and how you make streets and how you make squares and how you make parks. I think it is easy to enlarge the beautiful character of this downtown by those means. I think there are architects out there who could deliver. It's probably going to be a very slow process that requires community participation and community direction. And I think there has to be some other way of doing business. Clearly, the 7-year way of doing business, here's my pro forma, and I need to make money, and therefore I put a building up, maybe ugly, maybe good, but it doesn't matter. All of that cannot be the way of the future, not only here, but anywhere. There has to be a 20 and 30 and 50-year way of making buildings. The people who made these buildings that you love and you live within are people who never thought of their buildings as being 7 years in their lifetime. They spent an enormous amount of money to make them happen. They did not worry about the future value of their cash. They valued about their way of life and that of their community. And that's a fundamental philosophical shift of a kind that cannot happen in any other city but one that is this prosperous and this beautiful. This could be a national example, for instance, about how you fill the downtown with the rest of the buildings that it needs.
You talked about the idea that in order for this place to be an emblem for the nation, in order for Lake Forest to actually sort of regain the kind of prestige that it had when Shaw first did that Market Square, and all of a sudden it became an example to the nation about how you could handle a commercial and civic district in the middle of what was otherwise, sort of a newly growing American, set of residential communities. You talked a lot about sustainability, and what is the role? Give us a big picture view of what you mean when you say sustainability as it relates to the making of place.
We were very lucky at the university last year to receive a $30 million gift to start a program in preservation. And of course, preservation, because we are in the holy of holies of a preservation society here, started from the perspective of saving your grandmother's Victorian house in Newport, Rhode Island. That's where it started. And so it has gone through the stages of development that you have presented in your slides, but it's reached a point now where it's about something completely different. We're entering horizon, and we're going to be teaching our students here and in Rome to understand preservation as being a matter of not being able to destroy anything that we do. We don't have enough resources to tear the buildings that we don't like down and to rebuild them. We don't have enough resources to run poorly built buildings. We don't have enough resources to build buildings we cannot use well in the future. And so I'm afraid in the next 30, 50, 100 years, some of you are young enough that you might be able to go 50 to 100 years in the future, we're going to see many fewer new buildings built and a mad rush to deal with all the detritus of leftover stuff that we've made poorly during this 50 years of a Wild West economy. And so sustainability in building means being able to build buildings that are themselves built to last, but which entertain and include a life of frugality. Frugality in the way one lives in a neighborhood, frugality one is serviced in a district, frugality by which one walks mostly to work, and frugality by which one also mostly takes a train to Chicago. You are incredibly well placed because of your connection to Chicago to be that kind of city in the future, despite the climate, which is not particularly friendly. You have to warm yourselves in the winter, clearly. I mean, maybe air conditioned in the summer, but who knows? Maybe in 30 years, we'd have to wear more sweaters at night.
He summers in Greece, and he landed 2 years ago in South Bend as our new dean at the School of Architecture, and suddenly he realized that this white stuff falls out of the sky. In South Bend, at least, it falls out of the sky about 9 months out of the year, sometimes 3 feet at a time. If you were an architect, and an architect with the urban sensibilities you have, and you're an architect, so if you were the architect that the community brought in and said, there's this part of the town where we're going to build housing, and we're going to build housing to accommodate 35, 40 families, 50 families, and here's the site that we have available to us. Walk us through what an architect who's sensitive to character and harmonious character, an architect who's sensitive to placemaking, what's the approach to that problem solving like? And I ask it as a way of kind of helping all of us get an understanding of what might we ask of the architects who get tasked, who are the ones that get tasked with these projects. what are the sort of touchstone aspects of how you approach proper placemaking when all you get to do is one building? What are the things that you view as sort of obligations and responsibilities, that civic responsibility phrase I used earlier, and how do you go about solving that problem? Walk us through just an imaginary example.
I would say one thing which should not be read as bragging, but as an answer to your question. And then I'll continue a little bit deeper into what you asked. My wife is also my partner, Liz Moll, and I have had a practice in Pasadena, in California, for about 35 years. During the pandemic, we had to send a Christmas card, and it was not a particularly nice moment in the life of our country, and our family, our neighborhood. We were all stressed 2 years ago. And so we said, well, we can't send a happy card or some kind of irrelevant card. Let's send them a card to tell people we are at home and think of them. Let's send them a plan of Pasadena and put in all our, it was an office card, by the way, not a professional card, and put all the projects we've done. And we'd never actually taken the city of Pasadena and put all the projects we've done in our city. And we've done 30 projects in 30 years. So then, one day, we sat at dinner, because it's kind of so strange every night to be sitting with your partner at dinner. It's a whole other problem. Or challenge, let's say, not problem. So we have a 15-minute introduction that takes care of everything as professional, and then we have a husband-wife dinner. But the interesting thing is that of all of those projects, we have had to present them to a design review commission. Pasadena has a very strong, very binding, very complicated design review process. And we've won every one of the 30 first time around. So you can clap, you can say there's people magicians, but you know what it is? It's sitting down with people and talking to them and listening. That's the secret of a town and small city practice. You have to sit down, the developers and the architects have to sit down with the politicians and with the citizens and listen to what matters. And you know what the ultimate secret of this is? Because there is another part to it that's important. Because we've refined this idea of practicing, this way of being, we never ask for more. We just go and say, this is what we want, and these are the reasons why, after heard from everybody. And we haven't lost one case in 30. So that shows you that gaining, again, I'm not talking about myself, I'm talking about our beloved profession, right? And those who support us and our clients. Getting the confidence of a society that you're doing the right thing for them is really important. And I cannot say with a straight face that the work that's gone on here since 1970 can be trusted very much. I don't want to go into great detail about all of that. I've been only here for 5 hours, so I have to keep my comments short. But there are, when you see buildings that are 100 years old, the Hart Van Doren Shaw project is shown at Harvard every year at the retail course I'm a part of, at the executive course, every summer by Bob Gibbs, who's the retail consultant in the United States on the New Urbanist side, as the most important example of a working, community-based, magnificent environment of this scale, at this scale. So those things do matter, and they happen with community consensus. 50 years ago, 70 years ago, 100 years ago, because maybe the society was simpler, more uniform, I'm not exactly sure what the reasons were, architects acted in a way that was community supported. And that is not true today, and therefore architects have to make a triple effort to make that happen.
I'm guessing one of the reasons everybody's here today is there's a sense that the ecosystem, the architectural ecosystem, this ecosystem is pretty fragile. And there's the sense that this, that the ecosystem equivalent of a COVID outbreak is going to hit where one block will suddenly take an architecturally and urbanistically bad turn, and as a consequence, dominoes fall. And so one bad thing becomes precedent for allowing other bad things to happen.
Yeah.
And the next thing you know, this becomes that lovely little sealed in amber vestige of the world we used to love, the world we wanted to inhabit, the world that used to be Lake Forest. Remember the old days when the market square, when we used to go to the market square and see Santa Claus in the square or something? And suddenly as these sites become available and of course with economic tightening right now, maybe that's going to change a little, but money has been pretty freely available. There's this huge incentive to say there's a lot of really exceptionally beautiful and intact and well-maintained housing stock here, an array of scales and dollar values from more humble cottages up to great Adler and Lindeberg and other country homes. And so developers recognize that this is a desirable place to live. That train line you described earlier that gets people comfortably, easily back and forth from Chicago, a sense that this is a great place to just sort of live as a family or even by yourself. But it's a fragile ecosystem. As the powers that be that are helping to assure that the city remains healthy and vibrant in the future, the governance of the city, as they oversee these approaches to them for new projects, what would be the best mechanism to help assure that that fragile ecosystem doesn't suddenly get whacked in a way that basically the horse is out of the barn and it becomes very, very difficult to ever then put boundaries back on, and again, this just becomes a sort of quaint memory of, oh yeah, that was that little Howard Van Doren Shaw thing. Now we're doing these big boxed residential structures up and down streets, and they're 4 stories tall, then they become 5 stories tall. How can this group and others like them take a more active role to help just maintain that ecosystem healthy, let it grow, but let it grow in a way that maintains its integrity, its character, it just becomes bigger? Sorry. Thought it was an easy question.
That's quite the question.
A softball question.
Well, I mean, it's back to the beginning. There are 3 basic parties: the community, the designers who have an extraordinary responsibility, and the developers. And there are responsible developers in the world, that we know for sure, and extraordinary ones. On the new urbanist front, there are people who want to get the value of what they do in a longer period of time than 7 years. On the design front, you should be hiring architects who have demonstrated an excellence in building in a way that corresponds to the way your town is. And not by repeating, but by emulating, by doing beautiful, expressive buildings that are different than the ones you have, but they're of their kind. And I would say on the public side, I think responsible and enlightened staff, responsible and leading figures on the civic front, on the elected front, and commissions and citizen participation, deep citizen participation in commissions, including design commissions. These are vital questions for the future of the city, and I want to make absolutely sure that I say those things, believing deeply that cities such as this should never become museums. Never. But they should not become fodder either.
One of the things that I know that you do, and one of the things that a number of architects these days are doing, and Perry does them here in the back, is in settings like this and in trying to understand how best to grow it in a way that maintains the integrity of the character of place, is something called a charrette. And most of the people in this room are probably not familiar with that phrase. Some may be. Can you describe to us what a charrette is, and would an urban design charrette for placemaking be a sensible or useful tool for Lake Forest at this sort of critical juncture?
Well, a charrette would be a very useful process in any city and in any setting in which the development interests, political interests, including administration, I shouldn't say interests, political guidance and interests of the community are actually coming together to discuss those things and maybe arriving at certain conclusions. We don't have opportunities in daily life to ever address the questions we're talking about today. So a charrette is an opportunity to bring those to bear, right? And what is a charrette? What happens in architectural practice very often is that projects such the ones we're discussing can need the input of 6 consultants. So by the time passes, you pick up the phone and say, Tom, when can we meet? Oh, Wednesday. And then when is the next one? And, oh, I'm sorry, I'm going to Paris. Or no, next week I'm going to California with the next person. The energy of project spreads, and the focus on communication, on effectiveness and final results dissipates. So what Charrettes do is that they operate in certain phases: discovery, the charrette itself, and then follow-up. And the charrette itself basically setting up in a room like this for a week and designing a development proposal, a growth and development proposal for a whole city, for a neighborhood, for a downtown, or whatever the scope of the work is, in such a way that there is agreement about the results or the conclusions that come out of such a process. And those are most typically expressed in physical designs with images and with codes that exemplify and consolidate the findings so that they can apply it by administration over time. And why is that important? Because here's why it would be important in particularly precious cities such as this. If this was not a precious city, we would have to wonder how to make it work. This is a South Bend problem. South Bend is virtually dead downtown. Maybe 10% of it is alive, dead from urban renewal. So the problem there is a chicken and egg question. Let's design it, but what if they don't come? How to make sure the economy works? Here the issue is exactly the opposite. The economy is robust, the physical place is robust, and how many, I haven't been here long enough, but how many open lots are there downtown? 6, 8, 10? So why would you not have a meeting over a week and a process over 3 or 4 months to discover and talk to each other about what would be the best way to occupy these 8 lots? A way that you could then present to people when they come and are willing to invest and work with you to build in this community. A charrette could also involve maybe a dozen architects, 6 architects, however many one wants to engage, who can also become the people that carry those projects out. So when somebody wants to build, let's say, an infill building in one of the missing teeth you're talking about, they would have a choice, and they would say, well, if you know about this, I'll hire you. So it's a way of operating, I think, that is more locally bound, and particularly, I think, sets itself up in some very significant way against the manner of metropolitan centers in our country. And I don't want to speak ill of metropolitan centers because they're extremely important to the country in every way. But the one thing that is not happening in metropolitan centers, and Chicago is a very good example of it, is that no one particularly cares about the form of the city. I've loved Chicago since the first day I came to America, but I'm depressed over what's going on in downtown Chicago. By the demolition of buildings and by the making of buildings that are routine, by and large. So when you actually exit and this is my second year in this region, so you have to forgive the freshness of my impressions. But when you go to Riverside, or when you come here, you go to South Chicago, to various places that have character and energy and place qualities, you recognize that those places are different than the metropolitan center of this region. And not only different in the way they are, different the way they operate, different the way the people living in them feel about who they are, and how they have to take care of their future. And there lies, I think, some very significant promise. That you have to align what you feel about this place, what this place could be, those who could support you in this respect, chosen to support you, and then some process by which this comes to be over the next 5 or 10 years.
So we're going to pass around a microphone for anyone and everyone that has questions, because obviously this is a kind of a broad brush conversation we had today, but it's happening because Lake Forest, and I have a lot of friends actually here in the room who've been sending me emails for months saying, oh my gosh, Tom, or I think it's OMG that they do, but they send it because they send it with their phones. And so they sent something to me saying, look at what's happening to the Edwin Hill Clark Library, right? It's like all the evidence of how to make a beautiful building is there, but it has to be a bigger building, right? Or, hey, Tom, Deer Path's a beautiful street. It's got some missing teeth along it, and there's an idea about something that could happen for a new residential structure there. And so I'm picturing this sort of Howard Van Doren Shaw-like or Stanley Anderson like building that would suddenly appear on the corner, and then you see an image of something that looks like that 4-part screen I put up with the buildings that could be in any city. And you think, but all the evidence of how to make good architecture as a language, as a kind of a set of not ideas, but also forms of making, how to treat commercial and residential, all that stuff. And if you drive the neighborhoods, it's there, but it's also there in abundance in the central district. How could you be surrounded by so many things and not understand that the cues, everything you need to know, is right there? It's literally like standing in the middle of a forest and saying, if I could only find a tree, I'd be able to get out of here.
But by the way, I didn't specify that when I said education, I didn't mean going to New York or to Pasadena.
Right.
I meant spending Saturdays walking around downtown in all weather and discussing what you see.
Right.
This is what we try to teach our students for the first 2 years. We're trying to teach them what they see. So we take them out and say, what do you see? What is this? Okay, it's red. Oh, it's red. Yeah. What material? Oh, brick. Oh, brick. What is a brick? And it goes on like that. And in the end, after 2 years, they see by themselves. It's an extraordinary thing. It's like reading, actually. And once you read the values of a city, then you are of that city in a very constructive way. You can pass judgment, you can give direction. And you're absolutely right. I mean, I would say 90% of all the examples of what needs to be done here in the next 10 years is already done. I'm not saying the same forms. I said the ways of addressing the urban and architectural issues are here.
Yeah, that image of Janus that I put up earlier was no accident. It was intended to be the best sort of totemic image I could find that said that all of you, and I've been on a lot of these historic house walking tours with a number of you. I've got some dear friends here, and I'm missing some spouses of some dear friends who aren't with us anymore. But when I went on those walking tours, it's like all that good, historic, beautifully accomplished architecture and urbanism, we see it all the time. We do have the garden walks, we look at the magnificent houses. But we also have to be looking in that other direction, because to pretend that nothing will happen is simply to be unhappily surprised when the stuff starts happening, because by the time that train starts leaving the Lake Forest train station, you can't board it any longer. You have to watch it as it leaves you. This group and today's gathering is intended to say that if we want to be on that train of keeping Lake Forest exceptional in the way that it is, we need to be on it now.
Okay, questions?
Questions, yeah.
Thank you to both of you guys. You've been just wonderfully full of ideas and full of great comments. So I have to start out by thanking you. But when you think about starting with the Charrette process, would that, before the Charrette actually even begun, would you start out by doing a survey of the buildings in town, where you go through and categorize and catalog the buildings and create a visual document in whatever media, but create some sort of document which actually documents all the different kinds of buildings? And would that be part of the process? Because it seems to me that you need to start with the base of using your eyes, as you've just pointed out, of taking a look at things and understanding what's here.
There are various phases to a process like this, and the first phase is essentially discovery. I would say discovery and communication. One of the most interesting things about charrettes, any outreach to the public, is if you're serious about it and you do it deliberately and carefully and fairly comprehensively, at the end of that process you know about 75% sure, with 75% certainty, what needs to be done. Because listening is a remarkable operation in that when people trust you and are willing to talk to you, they're literally telling you what's acceptable to them and what they want to see. It's not that they know exactly what needs to be done, but they're telling you what their level of acceptance would be of given ideas and given projects. Then the charrette itself takes place in a very short period of time, but then there is the next phase, which is operating on it, and again communicating, trying to figure out what the conclusions are and how and why. So it's a complicated process, and the level of documentation has largely to do with what one is doing. I mean, for a whole city, that would be a very complicated process, and a very lengthy process, probably a very expensive process, because there is so much to see and so much to learn. But the fact is that you don't want to operate on cities in places that are not threatened. You only do work in places where, in some way, there is a reason to operate on it in a 5, 10, 20-year horizon. And whoever sets up a process like this should approach it, I think, from that perspective.
Hi, I have a statement and then I have a question. I think that every development comes about because of the underlying zoning and what you can do or a developer can do on a property. And those are the rules of the game that show up when something's designed. So my question would be, and we in Lake Forest have a real opportunity now because we are going to be looking at the comprehensive plan again. And those are the rules of the game for these developers or for an architect or a builder. So my question is, are there model zoning ordinances somewhere in the country that you have seen that we might look to in Lake Forest? And also, are you aware of any sort of incentives for developers? Because obviously developers look and they say, here's my lot, like you were saying, I can build 40,000 square feet here, and they just do the numbers. And a box is the cheapest way to go, and that's the way they're going to make the most money, right? So are there any financial incentives that you have seen that have some teeth in an ordinance or incentives for developers?
Euclidean codes, which are typically use-based codes and not form-based codes, are very, very vague, and they're the ones who've caused the worst problems in cities such as this, right? Because they don't take into consideration any degree of sensitivity to place or to the explicit qualities of building in the way in which they build street fronts or they make street walls or they're serviced and so on. So I would say yes, there are model codes and crafted codes for particular places, methods for making codes that are mostly on the urbanist form-based side that can be very effective in suggesting how to build going forward. But remember, I said that those codes are probably much more effective when you have a whole downtown to deal with an extensive number of uncertainties about where to build and how to build, as opposed to a place where you have 7 lots or 8 places where you could build, where the subject becomes strongly architectural and from which maybe a coding instruction gets extracted. On the side of how to enable development, there are a lot of issues. I would say the first issue would be, and I'm not sure what's true here or not, that there ought to be no parking requirements in downtown Lake Forest. The municipality should build a couple of garages, and that's the end of it. People can build in the right form and save the enormous amount of money that goes into digging holes and into abandoning or not using land properly by surface parking. I mean, in this most precious of places, am I doing this? In this most precious of places, why would any land be touched by a car on a building lot? And so this is called the Park One system, where people actually come, leave their car, and walk. And it has been established through much of the work done by new urbanists that while on the one hand, I'm not sure what your numbers are here, but on a typical strip, numbers are between 4 and maybe 5, 6 cars per thousand. In working downtowns, there are 2 per thousand. So in walking downtowns, the parking requirements drop precipitously because because there is no need to go and park from place to place because you're walking from place to place. So a walkable environment is not a car-oriented environment. Certainly street parking the way it is around your downtown is perfect. I'm talking about the parking lots on private or city-held properties. So yes, that's one. The other one I think would be to avoid crew-cut buildings. I mean, one of the most depressing aspects of American cities made through Euclidean codes is that every building is 35 feet. I mean, if somebody would form smaller volumes to be contextually more responsible in all parts of a relatively large lot, why would you allow a person like this to step back 20 feet and build, 3,000 or 4,000 feet to a 4-story? What damage does that make or cause? But all of those things, and I think maybe the possibility of the municipality itself indulging in some relationship of making sure that buildings are better built, maybe on the environmental front or on any other front, material front. I mean, this is a very special project and based program that you have with very few buildings to come. And really the question is, how do you make buildings in the right form and the right degree of longevity, which is probably 100 to 500 years for this city?
Besides the zoning code here in Lake Forest, which is say may be adequated and may have too many exceptions, we also have a historic districts designation for the Market Square and for about 1/4 of our city. And in that area, we have a Historic Preservation Commission assigned separate and apart from the Plan Commission and the Zoning Board to look at developments and look at it principally from a standpoint of visual compatibility is a term that's used in our code. Is that a vehicle to achieve the sort of solutions you're suggesting, or is it something needed beyond that?
It's a difficult question because there just is no answer to how you build a great building. There is no answer. In what sense? Well, I don't think commissions are going to save the show, particularly if commissions are unwilling to say no. If commissions look at the building and say, this building does not clear the bar, then you should be able to say no. And of course, the developers are going to say, well, what will clear the bar? And you might have to say, another architect. or you might have to say, another developer. I mean, we're talking about Holy Land here. We're not talking about routine issues. I mean, this is really an important city, nationally important city. And I back to my Disneyland thing, is not to keep it that way, but the city to evolve that way. I'll give you a very, very interesting example. I was in Ecuador, in Quito, about 5 years ago, and the whole of downtown Quito is a monument to, is a UN monument of what are they called? It's not coming to me. World Heritage Site, thank you. And it started, I think, in 1540, that city, and by 1950, people were beginning to really undo it. So the leadership of that town decided we're going to save this one and sacrifice everything else. So it is like Rome, like Paris. They have stopped developing the center essentially, and the rest of it is just a bloody mess. And so I was walking around, I was thinking to myself, how sad it is that in order to make sure that places don't get destroyed, we have to stop development and turn the place to a museum, effectively, right? And this reminds me, the question you asked me before I did not answer. In Japan, the issue of preservation is not isolated from the issue of design and building. The holiest of shrines in Kyoto is being destroyed every, I think, 30 to 50 years, destroyed entirely, in order to be rebuilt with passing on the craft of design and building to the next generation of craftspeople, to make sure that this does not get frozen, either as an object and become venerated, or frozen as a technology that cannot be repeated. So all of these things operate together in the way the future of the city needs to be, I think.
with regards to your question about the Preservation Commission, I've found myself in front of the Historic Preservation Commission a number of times, and what I would say is that group is the sort of single best part of my experience working in this community. Where I live, and I'm not going to name the town because then they'll see it on the video and then it'll come back to haunt me. Where I live, there's a lot less care taken in the review of projects being proposed in the community, and unfortunate things happen. Not horrible things, but just things that basically keep bringing the standard of quality in that town, it's another North Shore town, keep bringing them further and further down. And this community has this group that is charged with ensuring that these buildings, and of course it's mostly in the residential districts, operate at a pretty high quality level and do some of the concerns that we've expressed today. They enforce it relative to new construction in those districts. I think that's a terrific thing, and that this town, this city, handles that better than I know anybody else doing. So the question is transporting that into what happens in this critical district, because the same kind of care and sort of intensive concern about continuity of character, harmoniousness of structures needs to happen, and that's not about having a cornice line up with a cornice. Because I could put cartoons up all day that show that two cornices lining up is utterly insufficient to make anything good by itself, right? There's a lot more to making good architecture. Diana knows that very well. She makes beautiful architecture. So there needs to be more, there needs to be that kind of Charrette mechanism that Dean Polyzoides is speaking about that puts into place a larger set of parameters so that something like the Preservation Commission here in this town can basically really act as the kind of, as effective gatekeepers that as the community grows, it has the same kind of integrity and consistency that they've been able to do a very good job, I think, assuring around the perimeter of the town, because I love working here for that reason.
I think rules are important. If there is zoning, whether it's effective or ineffective, it needs to be respected in its entirety. Because when you start breaking rules, you enter that slippery slope of what's good for me is not good for you, and the whole thing just gets completely muddled, and civic governance gets lessened, significantly lessened. So, but if we can revisit the rules and refine them, I think that would be preferable. And within the rules then, the commissions, the citizens groups that are overseeing the rules or judging upon those rules should have the prerogative to say no, as well as say yes, as well as say yes conditionally. I think there should be the entire range of possible outcomes when one comes in front of a civic discussion. And the difference between style and character, that's one that you asked me that I need to talk about, because it's an architectural question, a purely architectural question. Style is an abstraction that we often see inscribed upon a building, but buildings begin as ideas from the bottom up, and they're built out of material, they enclose space, they reflect their essence and their use on the general massing, and they express themselves in very explicit terms without any explanations whatsoever, the best of them. There are towers as markers, there are domes as makers of place, there are windows of certain sizes, there are rhythms in certain building types and not others, but all of that is not necessarily engaged in the detailed form of how something is delivered. And style, ultimately, although it is not totally disconnected from character, is applied at some level onto this character, and very often three-dimensionally, not in plane. And one of the problems of architecture is that because we operate mostly on paper before we draw it, this is propensity to flatten it out. So one has to think of all of these issues as being three-dimensional, and wherever, in a compositional sense, every part of every building is related to every other part, and together they communicate both the essence of that building, the way it is, what it represents, how it's to be used, and hopefully by the way it's actually built, how it will sustain itself over time. Because today we walked by certain buildings built in the 70s and 60s and 80s, which will be likely to make it another 10 years. Because, among other things, the style is pasted on.
I was inspired by what you said about Pasadena and the support that you have received, your city has received, to make sure everything is structurally integral to what your image is of the future. I wonder when your alderman and your city government is petitioning and presenting their platform for election, are they not only talking about, in our case, the schools and especially the West train expansion, but are they also in your community talking about their commitment to preservation?
The preservation issues has gone far beyond preservation. Preservation in Pasadena, by the way, which is not nirvana. I don't get the sense that everything is perfect there. There are lots of issues and lots of problems. But with the territory of discussion we've had, in 1973, during urban renewal, downtown Pasadena was urban renewed. And we lost 8 city blocks of historic buildings. And the citizens were so horrified. The place was in the throes of very bad smog in the 1960s, 70s. There was not very much resistance. And when people started seeing their city just dissolve in front of their eyes, they proposed a referendum and threw out the redevelopment agency and made every decision about preservation a city council decision. And since 1973, Pasadena has had a pro-preservation city council.
Wonderful.
So that's one thing. The other thing is that the process of saving buildings has led to more careful planning, district planning, neighborhood planning, and very strong commissions, and ways in which then council people end up putting people in these commissions. One council district has a seat in every commission, in a way that there is some direct relationship between the actions of the commissioners and the reputation of the council people. And it has got to the point, the other day I got a hurried telephone call from my wife who said, "You wouldn't believe this. Some guy called the door, knocked on the door yesterday, and he said that he's running for the city council district of where our house is, and he started telling me that he was in favor of walkable streets and you know, keeping retail close to walking to our house, and doing this and doing the other and doing the other." So the language and the issues of preservation and town planning and development have come into the actual elections themselves.
Okay. So thank you so much for this lively discussion, and thank you for coming today.